Welcome, everyone. Hope you're having a good day so far. As I'm sure I probably said at the beginning of class, I'm just repeating myself. Today in this Ed puzzle, what we're going to go over some background for the novel. Yesterday, as Mr. Marvin probably has already said, we talked about the historical context of this story. So we know it takes place during the 20s and 30s, during the Great Depression down in the South. So we talked about all of the racial tensions that were present during that time in that part of America. Lynchings, social rules, all of that really unfair, awful stuff. So today, what we're going to do, we're going to look at some of the main characters. We're going to talk about some of the thematic ideas in the story, and then we're going to read the first chapter. So we're going to be reading from our books. So if you don't have a book yet because you haven't gone to the school and picked it up, there is a link in the announcement that you can follow along with, or if you just like reading on the computer for some unknown reason, you should probably go get your head checked out because reading from a book is a lot better, in my own personal opinion. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's start out with a little preview, if you will. So To Kill a Mockingbird. It is in this setting that the novel To Kill a Mockingbird takes place. It happens in a small town in the deep South in the early 1930s, as we said. So the name of the town is Maycomb, Alabama. And as we said, it happens during the 1930s. So this is in the middle of the Great Depression. People are very poor. Racism is everywhere because it's the deep South. So the author, Harper Lee, and let me move my head. Harper Lee was born in 1926, and I believe she actually just passed away. Let me actually check that. Harper Lee. Okay, yeah, so she passed away in 2016. So she lived to be 90 years old. Well, actually 89. So she lived a long time. So Harper Lee, born in 1926, she was raised in the South. So she had a very good idea of how the South would look during the 1930s, because that's when she grew up. So she wrote this book during the 1960s. So when the civil rights movement was at its height of intensity, Martin Luther King Jr. was making his marches and his speeches. She released this book, and it was incredibly impactful. So let's build a little more context around this. In the 1950s, the winds of change began to blow, and Black Americans were no longer willing to be treated as lesser human beings, rightfully so. So Harper Lee, she was born, as we said, in 1926. She grew up during the Great Depression. She grew up in Monroeville, Alabama, in the heart of the South. And so she was very aware of racial tensions, and she saw African Americans being mistreated her entire life. Her dad was a lawyer, and her mother's maiden name was Finch. Keep that in mind for when we're looking at the characters. So this is one of the best-selling books in the nation's history, our nation. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's been translated into more than 40 languages, made into a super popular movie. It's black and white. We may or may not watch it. I don't know. And librarians across the country voted it the best novel of the 20th century, which is a pretty big deal considering you have a lot of novels written from 1900 to 2000. And this is considered one of, if not the best story of that time period, which is crazy. So it's frequently cited by readers as the book that's made the biggest difference in their lives, because through the lives of children, it allows the reader to walk around in the shoes of people who are different from ourselves. And it challenges the stereotypes of the Southerner, the African American, the eccentric, the child, and the young lady. So really, one of the big themes, and I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here, in this story is that you need to get into someone's shoes and walk around in them to really understand who they are. And so it really preaches against judging people off of first impressions because we might learn a lot about them and change our minds. So let's talk about the setting of the novel. So we know that Harper Lee, the author, grew up in Monroeville, Alabama. So this takes place in the fictional Macomb County, Alabama. Written, or it takes place in 1933 to 1935. The narrator, our main character, is Scout Finch. So this is written from the first person. It's written from Scout's perspective. Whoa. And this is her in the movie. Man, my head is just in the way. I'm just going to leave myself right here. So, first person narrator, written from Scout's perspective, and it's written from the future talking about the past. So it's a flashback. The whole thing is. Scout's tone is childlike because during the story, she's a child. She's humorous, she's innocent, and as the novel progresses, you'll see that there's some terrible stuff that happens, and so she gets very critical of society. Harper Lee bases Scout somewhat on herself. So imagine that our narrator, Scout, is kind of the author too. So Scout has matured over the years and humorously comments on the innocence she displayed in her thoughts and actions as a young girl. She mostly tells of her thoughts, but focuses on her brother Jem's thoughts also. So this is our main character. It's written from her perspective. We are going to be seeing the story through her eyes. And again, her name is Scout Finch, which Finch, her mother's maiden name, kind of taking from her own life. Interesting. Her older brother is named Jem, and so this is what he looks like in the movie. And he undergoes a transformation from being an innocent child to a young adult who is faced with the realities of living in a small town where prejudice, racism, and bigotry are all present. And so it's kind of a challenge to him because he has his expectations of the world and how it should be, and he has to come to terms with the fact that, well, the world isn't always a great place. So that's Jem. So we have Scout, our main character, and Jem, her older brother. Lastly, we have Atticus Finch. He is the father and only parent to Scout and Jem. So this is him in the movie, as with the other two characters. He is a local lawyer, just like Harper Lee's biological father. So again, kind of contributing to this whole idea that Harper Lee was writing herself in this story. The dad in the story is a lawyer, just like hers. And he is a lawyer defending a black man accused of raping a teenage girl in the 1930s during the midst of the Great Depression. So if you remember yesterday, we talked about how there were several instances of white women who claimed that they were raped by black men, and like the Scottsboro Boys. And even when it was completely false, it was impossible because they weren't even all in the same train car. There were so many holes in the story. The Scottsboro Boys, most of them were still held in prison, even though they literally said, "Oh no, I take that back. It was a lie. We lied." So that is one of the main conflicts of this story. So what are some of the major thematic ideas? So a theme, usually in sentence form, it's whatever the author is trying to teach us. So what are some of the topics that the author is trying to talk to us about? Well, prejudice and racism, the most obvious one. Equal justice, courage. So what makes somebody courageous? Is it doing the right thing? Is it being able to stand up to someone? Can you be courageous in a very weak physical person, or do you have to be strong? What happens when we exclude people or ostracize people and leave them out of social groups? Maturation, it's like growing up. Heroism, tied into courage. Friendship, innocence, and what can happen to it. What kills innocence? So those are some of the major thematic ideas. So some literary terms that we're going to zero in on over the course of this novel. Illusion, not like illusion like, oh, I thought I saw something, but I'm not sure I did. That's illusion with an I. Illusion with an A is a reference within a literary work to another fiction work, a film, piece of art, or a real event. So if a story mentions Santa Claus, that's illusion. Or if a story mentions another movie, that's illusion. It's just one story mentioning another thing. So what are some positives of illusion? Well, one, it's a way of drawing on an outside work to provide greater context or to give more meaning to the situation. What are some negatives? Well, people don't always understand or know the work or object being referenced. So sometimes it's like if you're trying to give a metaphor or a simile and the other person just doesn't understand it, it doesn't work. So similar thing happens here. So symbolism, we've talked about that. People, places, or things used to represent something else in literature. So personal symbols are certain objects, or that's when certain objects mean certain things to us. Cultural symbols, you have Hang On Sloopy, which is an Ohio State reference. And then cultural, like you have male and female, the colors. This is a symbol for death. This is a symbol for peace. We've talked about symbolism before and how it just means that something represents something else, like the Scarlet Ibis. So literary terms focus. Number 3, idiom. So what is an idiom? An idiom is when a meaning cannot be deduced from the literal definitions or arrangements of words. We know idioms as sayings, like keep your chin up. Life has been difficult for you recently, but keep your chin up. Everything will be better soon. So what does that mean? If we ask, keep your chin up, you want me to march around like this? That's kind of weird. No, that's not literally what it means. It means like stay strong, keep going. Everything's going to be okay. You're going to make it through. Just keep on doing what you need to do. He says nice things to me when we're together, but he makes jokes about me when we aren't. He's two-faced. So does that mean that he literally has two faces? Because that'd be kind of scary. No, it just means like hypocritical. That really gets my goat, is the saying underneath that line. Yeah, so that really gets my goat. What is getting your goat and why are they stealing it? No, that's not what it means. It just means that you're annoyed. So idioms are popular sayings that if you look at them literally don't make sense, but because they're said enough throughout society, we understand. All right, so we are not going to do this writing assignment. We are instead going to start the story right away. All right, so we are going to start reading this story, and we're just going to read through the first chapter. And so, as I said earlier, if you don't have your copy of the novel, please go to the school and pick it up as soon as you can. Otherwise, you can use the link that's posted in the Google Classroom and follow along on that. So this right here is a picture of the Finch household in the movie. So if you are a visual person, you want to kind of see where that's coming from, or you want to like envision the setting a little more, you can do that. All right, so starting at chapter 1, which mine looks like this. Maybe yours is a little different, but it's all the same writing, even if the actual book looks a little different. So, starting in chapter 1. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed, and Jem's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, or fixed, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right. When he stood or walked, the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintained that the Ewells had started it all, but Jim, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. I said if he wanted to take a broad view of the thing, it really began with Andrew Jackson. If General Jackson hadn't run the creeks up the creek, Simon Finch would never have paddled up the Alabama, and where would we be if he had? We were far too old to settle an argument with a fist fight, so we consulted Atticus. Our father said we were both right. So, they're talking about this. Jem broke his arm, and so when they're old and looking back on this, because as we said, this story takes place in the past, they're like, oh, well, what started this whole thing that led to me breaking my arm? Well, I think it was the Ewells. Well, I think it can go a bit further back than that and say it started when Dill came and started hanging out with us. Well, if you want to go back that far, Jem, it really started when Andrew Jackson drove the Indians up the creek and our great-great ancestor, Simon Finch, settled. So, just giving a little background on them. Being Southerners, it was a source of shame to some members of the family that we had no recorded ancestors on either side of the Battle of Hastings. All we had was Simon Finch, a fur-trapping apothecary from Cornwall whose piety was exceeded only by his stinginess. In England, Simon was irritated by the persecution of those who called themselves Methodists at the hands of their more liberal brethren. And as Simon called himself a Methodist, he worked his way across the Atlantic to Philadelphia, thence to Jamaica, thence to Mobile, and up the St. Stephen's. Mindful of John Wesley's strictures on the use of many words in buying and selling, Simon made a pile practicing medicine, but in this pursuit he was unhappy lest he be tempted into doing what he knew was not for the glory of God, as the putting on of gold and costly apparel. So Simon, having forgotten his teacher's dictum on the possession of human chattels, bought 3 slaves and with their aid established a homestead on the banks of the Alabama River, some 40 miles above St. Stephen's. He returned to St. Stephen's only once to find a wife, and with her established a line that ran high to daughters. Simon lived to an impressive age and died rich. So just again, establishing like how the Finch family got into Maycomb. It was through this guy, Simon Finch, just who's like their great-grandfather. It was customary for the men in the family to remain on Simon's homestead, Finch's Landing, and make their living from cotton. The place was self-sufficient, modest in comparison with the empires around it. The landing nevertheless produced everything required to sustain life except ice, wheat, flour, and articles of clothing, supplied by riverboats from Mobile. Simon would have regarded with impotent fury the disturbance between the North and the South, as it left his descendants stripped of everything but their land. Yet the tradition of living on the land remained unbroken until well into the 20th century, when my father, Atticus Finch, went to Montgomery to read law, and his younger brother went to Boston to study medicine. Sorry about that. Mr. Crotts had an announcement. So, Atticus went to Montgomery to read law, aka to study to be a lawyer. And his younger brother went to Boston to study medicine. Their sister, Alexandra, was the Finch who remained at the landing. She married a taciturn man who spent most of his time lying in a hammock by the river, wondering if his trot lines were full. When my father was admitted to the bar, he returned to Maycomb and began his practice. Maycomb, some 20 miles east of Finch's Landing, was the county seat of Maycomb County. Atticus's office in the courthouse contained little more than a hat rack, a spittoon, a checkerboard, and an unsullied code of Alabama. His first 2 clients were the last 2 persons hanged in the Maycomb County Jail. Atticus had urged them to accept the state's generosity in allowing them to plead guilty to second-degree murder and escape with their lives, but they were Haverfords, and in Maycomb County, a name synonymous with jackass. The Haverfords had dispatched Maycomb's leading blacksmith in a misunderstanding arising from the alleged wrongful detention of a mare, were imprudent enough to do it in the presence of 3 witnesses, and insisted the son of a bitch had it coming to him was a good enough defense for anybody. They persisted in pleading not guilty to first-degree murder, so there was nothing much Atticus could do for his clients except be present at their departure, an occasion that was probably the beginning of my father's profound distaste for the practice of criminal law. So, the that whole story. Why does Atticus hate practicing law? Well, it's because the first two people that he was trying to defend were idiots who insisted that, oh no, we're fine. Like, we killed this guy, and there were three witnesses, and that's fine. We'll just tell them that they had it coming, and that's it. Of course, it's a stupid argument. Atticus couldn't do anything, and his first two clients died. So that's why he hates medicine. Sorry, that's why he hates law. During his first 5 years in Maycomb, Atticus practiced economy more than anything. For several years thereafter, he invested his earnings in his brother's education. John Hale Finch was 10 years younger than my father and chose to study medicine at a time when cotton was not worth growing. But after getting Uncle Jack started, Atticus derived a reasonable income from the law. He liked Maycomb. He was Maycomb County born and bred. He knew his people. They knew him. And because of Simon Finch's industry, Atticus was related by blood or marriage to nearly every family in the town. Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade under the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. The day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. Nothing to see outside the boundaries of Maycomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Maycomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. So that's from FDR and the New Deal starting up an attempt to revitalize the economy during the Great Depression. We lived on the main residential street in town, Atticus Gemini, plus Calpurnia, our cook. Gemini found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read to us, and treated us with courteous detachment. Calpurnia was something else again. She was all angles and bones. She was nearsighted. She squinted. Her hand was white as a bed slat and twice as hard. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave as well as Jem when she knew he was older, and calling me home when I wasn't ready to come. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jem was born, and I felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember. Our mother died when I was 2, so I never felt her absence. She was a Graham from Montgomery. Atticus met her when he was first elected to the state legislature. He was middle-aged then. She was 15 years his junior. Jem was the product of their first year of marriage. 4 years later, I was born, and 2 years later, our mother died from a sudden heart attack. They said it ran in her family. I did not miss her, but I think Jem did. He remembered her clearly, and sometimes in the middle of a game he would sigh at length, and then go off and play by himself behind the car house. When he was like that, I knew better than to bother him. When I was almost 6 and Jem was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within calling distance of Calpurnia, were Mrs. Henry Lafayette DuBose's house 2 doors to the north of us, and the Radley place 3 doors to the south. We were never tempted to break them. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, the mere description of whom was enough to make us behave for days on end. Mrs. DuBose was plain hell. That was the summer Dill came to us. Early one morning, as we were beginning our day's play in the backyard, Jem and I heard something next to Miss Rachel Haverford's collar patch. We went to the wire fence to see if there was a puppy Miss Rachel's rat terrier was expecting, and instead we found someone sitting looking at us. Sitting down, he wasn't much higher than the collards. We stared at him until he spoke. "Hey, hey yourself," said Jem pleasantly. "I'm Charles Baker Harris," he said. "I can read." "So what?" I said. "I just thought you'd like to know I can read. You got anything needs reading, I can do it." "How old are you?" asked Jem. 4.5. "Going on 7." "Shoot, no wonder then," said Jem, jerking his thumb at me. "Scout yonder's been reading ever since he was born, and she ain't even started to school yet. You look right puny for going on 7." "I'm little, but I'm old," he said. Jem brushed his hair back to get a better look. "Why don't you come over, Charles Baker Harris?" he said. "Lord, what a name." "It's not any funnier than yours. Aunt Rachel says your name's Jeremy Atticus Finch." Jem scowled. "Well, I'm big enough to fit mine," he said. "Your name's longer than you are. Bet it's a foot longer." "Folks call me Dill," said Dill, struggling under the fence. "Do better if you go over it instead of under it," I said. "Where'd you come from?" Dill was from Meridian, Mississippi, was spending the summer with his aunt, Miss Rachel, and would be spending every summer in Macomb from now on. His family was from Macomb County originally. His mother worked for a photographer in Meridian, had entered his picture in a beautiful child contest and won $5. She gave the money to Dill, who went to the picture show 20 times on it. "Don't have any picture shows here except Jesus ones in the courthouse sometimes," said Jim. "Ever see anything good?" Dill had seen Dracula, a revelation that moved Jem to eye him with the beginning of respect. "Tell it to us," he said. Dill was a curiosity. He wore blue linen shorts that buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. As he told us the old tale, his blue eyes would lighten and darken. His laugh was sudden and happy. He habitually pulled at a cowlick at the center of his forehead. When Dill reduced Dracula to dust and Jem said the show sounded better than the book, I asked Dill where his father was. "You ain't said anything about him." "I haven't got one." "Is he dead?" "No." "Then if he's not dead, you've got one, haven't you?" Dill blushed, and Jem told me to hush, a sure sign that Dill had been studied and found acceptable. Thereafter, the summer passed in routine contentment. Routine contentment was improving our treehouse that rested between giant chinaberry trees in the backyard, fussing, running through our list of dramas based on the works of Oliver Optic, Victor Appleton, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. In this manner, we were lucky to have Dill. He played the character parts formerly thrust upon me, the ape in Tarzan, Mr. Crabtree in the Rover Boys, and Mr. Damon in Tom Swift. Thus we came to know Dill as a pocket Merlin, whose head teemed with eccentric plans, strange longings, and quaint fancies. So that's where we will pause for today. We will finish chapter 1 and 2 on Friday. So in the meantime, make sure that you have answered all of the questions up until this point. And if you have questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Friday or tomorrow if you have any questions. And make sure, again, that you are trying to get this book. And we'll finish chapters 1 and 2 on Friday.